Welcome to Let's Get Weird in the Dark. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most horrifying execution methods in recorded history. A ritual so brutal, so extreme, that historians have debated for centuries whether it actually happened or whether it was psychological warfare. Propaganda designed to terrify enemies. The Blood Eagle. A Viking execution method described in medieval Norse sagas. An act of violence so elaborate, so ritualistic, so unthinkably cruel that even reading the descriptions is disturbing. If you've seen the television series Vikings, you've seen a depiction of this. That scene where King Aelle meets his end. The one that's almost impossible to watch. That's based on historical sources. Or at least, on what those sources claim happened. But was it real? Did Vikings actually perform this execution? Or was it poetic exaggeration? A legend that grew in the telling? A story meant to make enemies fear what would happen if they crossed the Norse? Tonight, we'll examine the evidence. The saga accounts. The historical context. And the central question that historians still debate. Close your eyes. Settle in. This is dark history. Real or imagined, this is what the Vikings wanted their enemies to believe they were capable of. Let's explore the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle, as described in Old Norse texts, was an execution method reserved for the worst enemies. Kings who had wronged you. Betrayers. Those who deserved not just death, but a death that would be remembered. A death that would serve as warning and spectacle. Here's what the sagas describe. The victim would be placed face down. Restrained. Conscious. What follows is not easy to hear, but it's what the historical sources claim. The executioner would cut the ribs away from the spine on both sides. Starting at the lower back, working upward. The ribs would be spread outward, opening the back cavity. The lungs would then be pulled out through this opening and arranged on the shoulders. The shape created, ribs spread like wings, lungs draped over the shoulders, resembled an eagle. Hence the name. The Blood Eagle. The victim would be left in this position. Still alive, if the accounts are to be believed. The sources claim that dying this way without crying out was considered honorable. That making it through the ritual in silence was a way to die with dignity despite the horror. This is what the sagas describe. This is what the Viking sources claim happened to specific historical figures. But before we examine whether it was real, we need to understand the sources themselves. The Blood Eagle is mentioned in several Old Norse texts. These are medieval manuscripts, written down centuries after the events they describe. The Vikings themselves didn't write much during their era. Most of what we know comes from sagas recorded in Iceland in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. The most detailed account appears in the Orkneyinga saga. This saga describes the Blood Eagle being performed on King Halfdan Hálfleg, also called Halfdan Longleg, by Earl Thorfinar around 850 AD. The saga provides specifics about the ritual. Another account appears in the tale of Ragnar's sons. This describes the Blood Eagle being performed on King Aelle of Northumbria by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, in revenge for their father's death. This is the execution depicted in the Vikings television series. There are references in other texts as well. The Heimskringla. The Prose Edda. Various other sagas mention it, sometimes in detail, sometimes just as a reference to something the audience would understand. But here's the critical point. All of these sources were written 200 to 400 years after the events they describe. None are contemporary accounts. None were written by people who witnessed a Blood Eagle execution. These are stories. Passed down orally for generations before being written down. And in that time, details can change. Events can be exaggerated. Myths can be presented as history. So the question becomes, are these accounts describing something that actually happened? Or are they describing a legend? A story Vikings told about themselves to enhance their reputation for brutality? Some historians argue the blood eagle never existed as a physical act. They believe it's a misunderstanding, a mistranslation, a poetic phrase taken literally. Old Norse poetry was complex. It used kennings, metaphorical compound expressions. It described things indirectly. Whale road meant ocean. Battle sweat meant blood. The language was layered with meaning. These historians suggest blood eagle was a kenning, a poetic way of describing death in battle. The phrase originally meant something like, to mark with a bloody eagle, a reference to carrion birds feeding on battlefield dead. Eagles and ravens were symbols of Odin. Finding dead warriors was their role. In this interpretation, saying someone was given the blood eagle meant they died in battle and their body was left for the eagles. It was metaphor, not description of a specific execution method. Later saga writers, these scholars argue, took the phrase literally. They constructed a detailed execution ritual based on a misunderstanding of poetic language. They created the blood eagle execution from a phrase that originally just meant killed and left for carrion birds. This theory has support. Old Norse poetry is indeed complex and metaphorical. Misunderstandings of kennings did occur. Later saga writers sometimes took poetic phrases literally and elaborated on them. But other historians disagree. They point to the detailed, consistent descriptions across multiple independent sources. They argue that the accounts are too specific, too similar to each other, to be pure invention. That something must have happened to generate these stories. To understand whether the blood eagle was real, we need to understand Viking culture and violence. The Viking Age, roughly 800 to 1100 AD, was brutal. Violence was common. Warfare was frequent. Raiding was an economic activity. Taking slaves was normal. Killing enemies was expected. The Vikings were not uniquely violent for their era. Medieval Europe was violent everywhere. But the Vikings had a reputation. They cultivated it. They wanted their enemies to fear them. When Vikings raided, they struck suddenly. They moved fast. They took what they could and left before organized resistance could form. Their success depended partly on speed, partly on fear. If your enemies believe you're capable of extreme violence, they're more likely to surrender quickly. More likely to pay tribute without fighting. More likely to flee rather than resist. Fear is a weapon as effective as swords. The Vikings understood this. They used psychological warfare. They had berserkers, warriors who fought in trance-like rages. They had Ulfhednar, men who dressed as wolves and howled before battle. They had rituals and symbols designed to terrify. Would they have created an execution method like the blood eagle to enhance this reputation? Absolutely. The question is whether they actually performed it, or just made sure everyone believed they did. Both serve the same purpose. If your enemies believe you'll inflict the blood eagle on captured leaders, they'll think twice before opposing you. Whether you actually do it or not is almost irrelevant. The belief is what matters. Who supposedly received the blood eagle? The sagas name specific people. Real historical figures in some cases. Halfdan Longleg was a real person. A Norwegian king in the 9th century. The Orkneyinga saga claims he was captured after a battle and executed by blood eagle by Earl Torfeinar, whose father Halfdan had killed. King Aelle of Northumbria was real. He died around 867 AD. The circumstances of his death are historically uncertain. The tale of Ragnar's sons claims he was captured by Viking forces and executed by Blood Eagle in revenge for killing the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether this is accurate or later legend building is unclear. Maelgwalai Mac Dunlange, an Irish king, is mentioned in some sources as receiving the Blood Eagle in the 11th century. Again, historical confirmation is lacking. What's notable is that all these supposed victims were kings or high-ranking leaders. The Blood Eagle wasn't described as a common execution for ordinary criminals or prisoners. It was reserved for enemies of exceptional importance. Leaders whose deaths needed to send messages. This pattern fits with the Blood Eagle being either real but rare, or legendary but strategic. Either way, it wasn't routine. It was exceptional. Meant to be remembered. Meant to be spoken of. Meant to create fear. As we dig deeper into the Blood Eagle, the questions multiply. If it was real, how was it performed while keeping the victim alive? The descriptions claim consciousness throughout. But the trauma, the blood loss, the shock, medical experts have serious doubts about whether a person could remain alive through this. If it was propaganda, why is it mentioned in multiple independent sagas? Stories don't usually remain consistent across different authors and centuries unless they're based on something. If it was metaphor misunderstood, why do the saga writers describe it in such specific physical detail? Why create such elaborate explanations for what was supposedly just a poetic phrase? And perhaps most importantly, what does it tell us about the Vikings that these stories exist at all? Whether real or imagined, the Blood Eagle reveals something about Norse culture. About their relationship with violence. About how they wanted to be seen. Let's examine what the sagas actually say. The specific words used. The details provided. Because the case for whether the Blood Eagle was real depends heavily on how we interpret these medieval texts. The Orkney Inga saga, written in Iceland around 1200 AD, tells the story of the Earls of Orkney. It describes events from the 9th century onward. One of its earliest stories involves Earl Thorfinar and King Halfdan Longleg. Here's the background. Halfdan was a Norwegian king who killed Thorfinar's father, Ragnvald. Thorfinar sought revenge. He pursued Halfdan to the Orkney Islands. There was a battle. Halfdan lost and was captured. The saga describes what happened next. In Old Norse, the phrase used is rist oreit now a baki on him. This translates roughly as cut an eagle on his back. The saga then provides more detail. It describes the ribs being separated from the spine. The ribs being spread. The lungs being pulled out and arranged. It describes this as a sacrifice to Odin, the chief Norse god. The text states that Halfdan died during this process. That he was conscious at the beginning. That the ritual was performed deliberately and with intention. This is the most detailed account we have. It's specific. It provides physical details. It names the victim, the perpetrator, the location, and the context. It presents the Blood Eagle as something that actually happened. But remember, this was written 350 years after the event. By an Icelandic scribe who had never met anyone involved. Based on oral traditions passed down through multiple generations. How accurate could such an account be? The second major account appears in the tale of Ragnar's sons, also called Ragnarsona A with acute TTR. This text was written in the 13th century, describing events from the 9th century. The story involves King Aelle of Northumbria. According to legend, Aelle captured the famous Viking Ragnar Lothbrok and executed him by throwing him into a pit of snakes. Ragnar's sons swore revenge. The sons raised a massive Viking army. They invaded Northumbria. They captured York. and they captured King Aelle. The saga describes their revenge. They cut the blood eagle on him. Again, the phrase "wrist right now a baki on him" appears. Cut the blood eagle on his back. The text describes the ritual in less physical detail than the Orkneyinga saga, but it's clear that the same execution method is meant. The ribs cut. The lungs exposed. The eagle shape created. The saga adds an interesting detail. It claims Aelle showed courage during the execution. That he didn't cry out. That he died with honor despite the circumstances. This theme, dying bravely through torture, appears in multiple Norse texts. Now, here's what we know historically about King Aelle. He was a real person. He did rule Northumbria in the 9th century. He did die around 867 AD when Vikings conquered York. But whether he actually died by blood eagle is uncertain. Anglo-Saxon sources from that era don't mention it. They simply record that he died when Vikings took the city. The blood eagle detail appears only in Norse sagas written centuries later. This pattern repeats. Norse sources claim blood eagle executions. Contemporary sources from the victims' cultures don't mention it, which raises questions about reliability. The blood eagle appears in other Norse texts, though usually more briefly. The Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson's history of Norwegian kings written around 1230, mentions it. In describing the death of King Halfdan, it uses similar language to the Orkneyinga saga. But it's less detailed. More matter of fact. As if referring to something the audience would already know about. The Prose Edda, also by Snorri Sturluson, contains a passing reference. Again, it's mentioned as if it's common knowledge. As if the blood eagle is something everyone understands without explanation. Skaldic poetry, the complex, metaphorical Norse verse, occasionally includes references that might be related. But these are ambiguous. Remember the linguistic debate from earlier. These could be metaphorical references to battlefield death, not literal execution methods. What's notable is the consistency. When detailed accounts appear, they describe the same ritual. Ribs separated from spine. Lungs exposed. Eagle shape. Sacrifice to Odin. The details match across independent texts. This consistency could mean the accounts are based on something real. That multiple saga writers are describing the same practice because it actually existed. Or it could mean the later writers were copying from earlier sources. That one detailed account became canonical, and other writers incorporated it into their own work. Medieval authors did this regularly. They borrowed from each other. They built on existing narratives. Several accounts describe the blood eagle as a sacrifice to Odin. This detail is important for understanding the ritual's supposed purpose. Odin was the chief god in Norse mythology. God of war, death, poetry, and wisdom. He was associated with ravens and eagles. Birds that feed on battlefield dead. Warriors who died bravely were said to be taken to Valhalla, Odin's hall, to feast and fight until Ragnarok. Human sacrifice to Odin was part of Norse religion. We have archaeological evidence for this. Temple sites show signs of ritual killing. Adam of Bremen, a Christian chronicler writing in the 11th century, described sacrifice practices at the Temple of Uppsala in Sweden. Every 9 years, he claimed, 9 males of every species, including humans, were sacrificed and hung in a sacred grove. So sacrificing enemies to Odin wasn't foreign to Viking culture. It was part of their religious practice. The question is whether the blood eagle was a specific form of that sacrifice, or whether later writers conflated battlefield executions with religious ritual. The eagle imagery fits Odin's symbolism. Eagles were his birds. Creating an eagle shape from a dying enemy could have been seen as offering that enemy directly to Odin, literally transforming the victim into Odin's symbol. If this was the intention, it suggests the blood eagle, real or not, had religious significance. It wasn't just about killing enemies. It was about killing them in a way that honored the gods and demonstrated piety. This religious context is crucial. It means the blood eagle, if real, wasn't random cruelty. It was ritual. It had meaning within Norse culture. It served spiritual and political purposes simultaneously. Setting aside whether it happened, let's examine whether it could happen. Whether the blood eagle, as described, is physically possible. The sagas claim victims remained conscious during the ritual. That they could show courage by not crying out. But is this medically plausible? Cutting the ribs away from the spine would involve severing multiple muscles. The intercostal muscles between ribs. The muscles along the spine. This would cause massive trauma. Blood loss would be immediate and severe. Even with cauterization or other methods to slow bleeding, the victim would go into shock quickly. Loss of consciousness would follow. The lungs themselves present another problem. Once exposed to air pressure and removed from the protective rib cage, they would collapse. Breathing would become impossible. Death would follow within minutes, possibly seconds. Could someone remain conscious through this? Could they avoid crying out? Medical experts are skeptical. The pain would be extraordinary. The body's automatic responses, shock, loss of consciousness, respiratory failure, would almost certainly occur before the ritual could be completed. This doesn't prove the blood eagle never happened. It suggests that if it did happen, the descriptions of conscious victims showing courage are probably exaggerated. The victim would die or lose consciousness quickly, regardless of their bravery. But this creates another possibility. Maybe the blood eagle was performed on people who were already dead or unconscious. Maybe it was a post-mortem mutilation, not an execution method. The sagas could have embellished the details about consciousness and courage to make the stories more dramatic. Remember the linguistic theory. That blood eagle was originally a metaphor. That it meant death in battle, body left for carrion birds. Looking at the language in context, this theory gains support. Old Norse poetry regularly used complex metaphors. Death had dozens of poetic expressions. To feed the ravens. To redden the eagle's beak. To give the wolf his fill. These were all ways of saying someone died in battle. The animals referenced were those that fed on corpses. Eagles. Ravens. Wolves. They were Odin's creatures. Their feeding was seen as the god claiming his due. Cutting an eagle could have been another such phrase. It could have meant killing someone in Odin's name. Marking them as Odin's claim. When a saga says someone cut an eagle on his back, it might have originally meant killed him as a sacrifice to Odin. Later writers, unfamiliar with the original poetic meaning, might have taken it literally. They might have created a physical ritual to explain the phrase. They might have elaborated on how you would literally cut an eagle shape into someone's back. And thus the detailed blood eagle descriptions were born. This interpretation explains the consistency of the accounts. Once one saga writer created the detailed execution description, others copied it. They were all explaining the same phrase, so they described the same ritual. It also explains why contemporary sources don't mention it. Because it didn't exist as a physical act. It existed as a poetic phrase that was later misunderstood. We've examined the major saga accounts. The Orkneyinga saga. The tale of Ragnar's sons. The references in other texts. We've looked at the religious context. The practical questions. The alternative interpretations. The evidence is complex. The sagas are detailed and consistent, but they were written centuries after the events. The linguistic theory is compelling, but it requires assuming multiple saga writers all misunderstood the same phrase. In the next segment, we'll look at what archaeology tells us. Whether physical evidence exists for the blood eagle or similar practices. And we'll examine other Viking execution and torture methods that definitely existed to give context for whether the blood eagle fits their patterns. If the blood eagle was a real execution method, performed on multiple high-ranking captives, we should expect to find physical evidence. Skeletal remains showing the distinctive damage pattern. Ribs separated from spine. Evidence of the ritual being performed. So what does archaeology tell us? The answer is complicated. We have thousands of Viking-era burials. We have mass graves from battles. We have execution sites. We have plenty of skeletal evidence of Viking-era violence. But we don't have clear, unambiguous evidence of the blood eagle. No skeleton has been found with the specific pattern of rib damage that the sagas describe. No burial shows clear signs that this ritual was performed. The archaeological record, as it stands, doesn't confirm the blood eagle existed. But that absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence. Here's why. The blood eagle, according to the sagas, was performed on kings and high-ranking leaders. These weren't common executions. They were rare, exceptional events. If it happened at all, it happened to perhaps a dozen people over 2 centuries. The chances of finding and correctly identifying those specific remains among thousands of Viking-era burials is small. And even if we found them, correctly interpreting the damage would be difficult. Ribs can be damaged in many ways. Post-mortem damage from burial, from excavation, from natural deterioration, all of this complicates analysis. So the lack of clear archaeological evidence doesn't disprove the blood eagle. But it doesn't confirm it either. We're left with the same uncertainty. What we do have is abundant evidence of other forms of Viking violence. Archaeological finds show us what Vikings definitely did to their victims. Mass graves from Viking raids show evidence of brutal violence. Skulls split by axes. Limbs severed. Defensive wounds where victims tried to protect themselves. This was the reality of Viking warfare. Quick, brutal, efficient killing. We also have evidence of executions. Decapitations are common in the archaeological record. Clean cuts through neck vertebrae. This was a standard execution method across medieval Europe, including among Vikings. We have evidence of hanging. Neck trauma consistent with strangulation. This was another common execution method, particularly for criminals and slaves. We have evidence of drowning. Bodies weighted down and thrown into bogs. This method was used for various crimes and had ritual significance in some Norse practices. What we don't have is evidence of elaborate torture executions on the scale the sagas described for the blood eagle. The archaeological record suggests Viking executions were usually quick and practical, not prolonged rituals. This is significant. It suggests that if the blood eagle existed, it was exceptional even by Viking standards. Or, it suggests the elaborate descriptions in the sagas don't match what Vikings actually did to their enemies. There's one archaeological find that deserves special attention. The Repton mass grave, discovered in England. In the 1980s, archaeologists excavating near Repton in Derbyshire found a mass grave containing at least 264 individuals. The burial dated to the late 9th century. The time when the Great Heathen Army, the massive Viking force that conquered much of England, was operating in that area. The grave contained warriors. Men, and some women, buried with weapons and Viking-style artifacts. These were almost certainly members of the Viking army, killed in battle or died from wounds or disease. What's interesting about Repton is the evidence of post-mortem manipulation. Some bodies showed signs of being disarticulated, taken apart, and rearranged. Bones from multiple individuals were mixed together. The burial was clearly ritualistic, not just a mass disposal of bodies. Some researchers wondered if any of these remains showed signs of the Blood Eagle. The grave was examined carefully. And the answer was, no. No evidence of the specific rib and spine damage the sagas describe. But Repton shows that Vikings did perform ritual manipulations of bodies. They didn't just bury their dead. They arranged them. They created meaningful displays with human remains. This cultural practice existed. So while Repton doesn't confirm the Blood Eagle, it confirms that Vikings had complex relationships with death and bodies. That ritual manipulation of the dead was part of their culture. That creating meaningful arrangements from human remains wasn't foreign to them. To understand whether the Blood Eagle fits Viking patterns, we need to look at other execution methods we know they used. Blotting was the Norse term for sacrifice. Animals and humans could be sacrificed to the gods. We have both textual and archaeological evidence for this. Sacrificial victims were sometimes hung from trees, dedicated to Odin. Sometimes drowned in bogs as offerings. Sometimes killed and burned. The methods varied, but the purpose was religious. To honor the gods. To seek their favor. To fulfill obligations to divine powers. Beheading was common for both execution and battle. It was quick. It was final. It demonstrated the executioner's skill and authority. Severed heads were sometimes displayed as warnings or trophies. Breaking on the wheel was used in some regions. The victim would be tied to a large wheel. Their limbs would be broken with clubs or iron bars. The wheel would then be raised on a pole and the victim left to die from exposure and injuries. This method was documented in medieval Scandinavia, though it may have been adopted from continental European practices. Disembowelment appears in some accounts. The victim would be cut open and their intestines removed. This was sometimes done while the person was still alive. The evidence for this is mostly textual, from sagas describing punishments for specific crimes like treason. Blood Eagle fits within this pattern in some ways. It's a sacrifice to Odin. It's symbolic, creating an eagle shape. It demonstrates the executioner's power. It's meant to be remembered and spoken of. But it's also more elaborate than most Viking execution methods. More complex. More ritualized. More extreme. Whether the Blood Eagle was real or not, its function was clear. To terrify. Medieval warfare relied heavily on reputation. If your enemies believed you were capable of extreme violence, they might surrender without fighting. They might pay tribute rather than resist. They might flee rather than stand their ground. The Vikings understood this. Their success in raiding depended partly on speed and surprise, but also on fear. Communities that had heard stories of Viking brutality were more likely to submit quickly. So creating and spreading stories of extreme execution methods served a strategic purpose. Even if the Blood Eagle was never actually performed, the belief that it might be was valuable. This is psychological warfare. Creating a reputation so fearsome that the threat alone achieves your objectives. The Mongols would later use this strategy extensively. They would massacre entire cities to create terror, making other cities more likely to surrender peacefully. Did Vikings actually perform the Blood Eagle to create this fear? Or did they just make sure everyone believed they did? From a strategic standpoint, both approaches work. The sagas, written centuries later, might have been preserving these fierce stories, keeping alive the reputation of Viking ferocity. Whether the events described actually happened was less important than maintaining the cultural memory of Viking power. We keep coming back to the same issue. The sources for the Blood Eagle are all Norse. All written centuries after the events. All potentially biased toward making Vikings seem more fearsome. Where are the victim accounts? Where are the Anglo-Saxon chronicles describing what Vikings did to King Aelle? Where are the Irish annals detailing how Vikings executed their kings? These sources exist for other Viking violence. When Vikings raided monasteries, monks wrote about it. When Vikings killed leaders, contemporary chroniclers recorded it. We have plenty of hostile accounts of Viking activities from their victims. But none of these contemporary hostile sources mention the Blood Eagle. They describe Viking violence in detail, burnings, killings, torture, but not this specific ritual. This silence is telling. If the Blood Eagle was performed on important kings in public rituals, you'd expect someone from the victim culture to write about it, to record the horror, to use it as evidence of Viking barbarism. The absence of these accounts suggests one of two things. Either the Blood Eagle was so rare that it simply wasn't witnessed and recorded by the victims' cultures. Or it didn't happen, and the later Norse sagas invented or embellished it. We've examined the archaeological evidence, or lack thereof. We've looked at other Viking execution methods and how the Blood Eagle compares. We've considered the strategic function of extreme violence narratives. And we've noted the suspicious absence of victim accounts. The evidence remains ambiguous. Nothing proves the Blood Eagle existed. Nothing proves it didn't. We're left with saga accounts that are detailed and consistent, but also late and potentially unreliable. In the next segment, we'll look at modern scholarly debate. The historians who argue it was real. Those who argue it was metaphor. Those who take middle positions. And we'll start to build toward a conclusion about what likely happened. Other scholars argue the Blood Eagle never existed as a physical execution. It was poetic metaphor that later writers misunderstood. This position, championed by scholars like Roberta Frank, focuses on the linguistic evidence. Old Norse poetry used complex metaphors called kennings. Death was described poetically. To feed the ravens. To redden the sword. To visit Odin's hall. These were all ways of saying someone died. To cut an eagle or to give someone an eagle could have been another such metaphor. It meant death in battle. The body left for carrion birds. Eagles and ravens were Odin's creatures. Saying someone received an eagle meant they died as a sacrifice to Odin. These scholars point to the fact that some saga passages use the Blood Eagle phrase without detailed physical descriptions. It's mentioned almost in passing, as if the audience would understand it as a figure of speech. Only later sources provide the elaborate execution details. This pattern, they argue, shows evolution of the concept. Early mentions were metaphorical. Later writers, unfamiliar with the poetic convention, took it literally. They invented physical details to explain what they thought was a real execution method. The absence of contemporary victim accounts supports this interpretation. If the Blood Eagle was really performed on King Aelle in 867 AD, Anglo-Saxon chroniclers would have written about it. They recorded other Viking atrocities in detail. Why not this one? Because, these scholars argue, it didn't happen. The Blood Eagle King Aelle received was metaphorical death in battle, not literal execution. The lack of archaeological evidence also supports this view. If this execution was performed even a dozen times over 2 centuries, we'd expect to find some skeletal evidence. We haven't. Because it wasn't a real physical act. These scholars acknowledge that Vikings were violent. That they did sacrifice enemies to Odin. That they committed atrocities. But they argue the specific Blood Eagle ritual is legendary, not historical. Some scholars take middle positions, arguing the truth lies somewhere between real execution and pure metaphor. One middle position suggests the Blood Eagle was real but post-mortem. Vikings did mutilate enemy bodies after death. Creating an eagle shape from a corpse would serve the same symbolic purpose as doing it to a living victim. It would still be a sacrifice to Odin. It would still terrify enemies. But it wouldn't require keeping someone alive through the procedure. This interpretation preserves the saga accounts while solving the medical plausibility problem. The ritual existed. It looked like the sagas describe. But the victim was already dead. The saga writers embellished the accounts to make the ritual seem more brutal than it was. Another middle position suggests the Blood Eagle might have been performed once or twice, then exaggerated through retelling. Maybe one particularly brutal leader did execute an enemy this way. The story spread. It became legendary. It was attributed to multiple different events. But the underlying event was singular, not a regular practice. This would explain why the sagas are consistent. They're all ultimately describing the same original event, elaborated in different contexts. It would explain the lack of archaeological evidence. It only happened once or twice. And it would explain why contemporary sources don't mention it. It was rare enough that it might not have been widely witnessed or recorded outside Norse oral tradition. A third middle position suggests the Blood Eagle existed as a concept or threat, but might rarely or never have been actually performed. Vikings talked about it. They threatened enemies with it. They used it for psychological warfare. But actually doing it was unnecessary if the threat alone achieved the goal. In this interpretation, the saga writers were recording what Vikings claimed they did, not necessarily what they actually did. The Blood Eagle existed in Norse culture as an idea, as a symbol of extreme revenge, whether or not it was ever physically carried out. Some scholars look at other cultures for comparison. Do we see similar execution methods elsewhere? Does the Blood Eagle have parallels that might support or undermine its historicity? Elaborate ritual executions existed in many cultures. The Romans had damnatio ad bestias, execution by wild animals in the arena. Medieval Europeans had breaking on the wheel. The Aztecs had various forms of heart sacrifice. Cultures throughout history have created ritualized, symbolic forms of execution. So the concept of the Blood Eagle isn't implausible just because it's elaborate. Humans have invented many elaborate ways to kill each other ritually. However, most of these other methods are well documented in contemporary sources. We have multiple accounts from people who witnessed them. We have archaeological evidence. We have descriptions from both the perpetrators and outside observers. The Blood Eagle has only the saga accounts, written long after the supposed events by the culture that allegedly performed them. No outside confirmation. No physical evidence. This makes it different from most other documented ritual executions. Some scholars point to flaying, removing someone's skin, as a potential parallel. Flaying appears in various historical sources. It was supposedly used by Assyrians, Aztecs, and medieval Europeans. But like the Blood Eagle, actual evidence for flaying is questionable. We have many artistic depictions and textual descriptions, but little archaeological confirmation. This parallel cuts both ways. It might suggest ritual executions are often more legendary than real. Or it might suggest that some brutal practices were real but rare enough that physical evidence doesn't survive. If there's a modern consensus, it's this: we don't know for certain, but skepticism is warranted. Most contemporary medieval historians lean toward the metaphor misunderstood interpretation. The linguistic evidence is strong. The absence of contemporary accounts is significant. The lack of archaeological evidence matters. But this consensus isn't universal. Respected scholars still argue for the Blood Eagle's historicity. The debate continues in academic journals and books. What's generally agreed is that whether or not the Blood Eagle was real, it was rare. This wasn't a common Viking practice. If it happened at all, it happened to a handful of high-ranking enemies in specific circumstances over 2 centuries. It's also agreed that the saga accounts contain legendary embellishments. Even scholars who believe the Blood Eagle was real don't think the sagas are accurate in every detail. The stories grew in the telling. And finally, there's agreement that the Blood Eagle served cultural purposes regardless of its historicity. It demonstrated Viking power. It terrified enemies. It became part of Norse identity. Whether the ritual was real or imagined, it was effective. We've examined the scholarly positions. Those who argue it was real. Those who argue it was metaphor. Those who take middle positions. And we've looked at where the modern consensus sits. In our next 2 segments, we'll synthesize this evidence. We'll examine what the Blood Eagle tells us about Vikings and their culture. And we'll offer our own assessment of what likely happened, based on the evidence we've reviewed. Whether the Blood Eagle was real or legendary, it reveals important things about Viking culture. About how they thought. How they related to violence. How they wanted to be seen. Let's step back from the question of historicity and ask what the Blood Eagle meant to Vikings. What purpose it served. What it tells us about their worldview. Because even if the Blood Eagle never happened, the fact that Vikings told stories about it matters. The fact that saga writers centuries later included it in their histories matters. The fact that it became part of Norse cultural memory matters. Stories reveal values. They show what a culture finds meaningful, frightening, or important. The Blood Eagle, real or not, was meaningful to Vikings. The heart of the Blood Eagle stories is a concept central to Norse culture: revenge. In Viking society, revenge wasn't just acceptable. It was obligatory. If someone killed your family member, you were expected to seek vengeance. Failure to do so brought shame. Your honor depended on settling scores. This wasn't random violence. It was structured. It followed rules. There were appropriate ways to seek revenge. There were circumstances that justified different levels of response. The Blood Eagle appears in contexts of extreme revenge. Thorfinar avenging his father. Ragnar's sons avenging their father. These weren't minor slights. These were murders of fathers by enemy kings. The most serious offenses requiring the most severe responses. The elaborateness of the Blood Eagle, if it existed, matched the severity of the offense. It wasn't just killing the enemy. It was killing them in a way that demonstrated the depth of your outrage. The extent of your determination to balance the scales. And it sent a message. That if you wronged someone enough, if you killed their father, if you committed the ultimate offense, this is what awaited you. Not a quick death. Not a simple execution. But something memorable. Something terrible. Something that would be talked about for generations. Whether Vikings actually did this or just wanted people to think they did, the function was the same. Demonstrating that revenge in Norse culture was serious. Was inevitable. Was something to fear. The Blood Eagle's connection to Odin is significant. Multiple saga accounts describe it as a sacrifice. As a religious ritual, not just an execution. Norse religion was transactional. You gave things to the gods and received things in return. Sacrifices bought favor. Proper rituals maintained cosmic order. The relationship between humans and gods required ongoing exchange. Odin, specifically, required blood. He was the god of war and death. Warriors who died bravely went to his hall. He valued courage, violence, skill in battle. Sacrificing enemies to Odin honored him and gained his support. Creating an eagle from an enemy's body had symbolic resonance. Eagles were Odin's birds. Odin himself could take eagle form. Transforming a dying enemy into an eagle was literally offering that person to Odin in the god's own image. If the blood eagle existed, it served religious purposes. It wasn't just revenge. It was piety. It was honoring the gods properly. It was maintaining right relationship with divine powers. And if it didn't exist, the stories served the same purpose. They reinforced that Vikings took their religious obligations seriously. That they honored Odin appropriately. That their violence had meaning beyond mere killing. Religion and violence were intertwined in Norse culture. The blood eagle, whether real or legendary, exemplifies this. It's impossible to separate the revenge aspect from the religious aspect. They're the same thing. How do humans create stories of extreme violence? What purpose do these narratives serve? Anthropologists and psychologists have studied this. Extreme violence stories appear in many cultures. The Aztec heart sacrifice. The medieval European execution spectacles. The Assyrian flaying. Stories of torture and brutality that exceed normal violence. These narratives serve multiple functions. First, they establish boundaries. They define what's beyond normal. What's reserved for special circumstances. The blood eagle, if it existed, wasn't for common criminals. It was for kings who committed ultimate offenses. The extremity of the punishment defines the extremity of the crime. Second, they create fear. Enemies who hear these stories think twice before acting. Communities that might resist reconsider. The threat of extreme violence controls behavior even if it's never carried out. Third, they reinforce group identity. We are the people who can do this to our enemies. It's a statement of power. Of fearlessness. Of commitment to group values. Whether or not you actually do it, believing you could is important for group cohesion. Fourth, they process trauma and loss. When someone kills your father, normal grief isn't enough. You need a narrative that matches the enormity of your loss. The blood eagle provides that. It's revenge proportional to pain. The Vikings, like many warrior cultures, needed these narratives. They lived with constant violence. They raided. They fought. They lost family members. They needed ways to think about and process this reality. The blood eagle, real or legendary, served these needs. It gave form to concepts of ultimate revenge. It provided a framework for thinking about extreme loss and extreme response. Even if the blood eagle was real, the stories about it certainly evolved over time. Oral traditions change as they're passed down. Details get added. Events get conflated. Different versions merge. By the time saga writers recorded these stories in the 12th and 13th centuries, they'd been through 300 years of oral transmission. We can see evidence of this evolution in the texts themselves. Early mentions are brief. Later accounts are detailed. The elaboration increases over time. This pattern suggests the stories grew in the telling. It's also likely that multiple different events got combined into a single narrative tradition. Maybe several different enemies were killed in different ways. Maybe some were sacrificed to Odin by hanging. Maybe some were mutilated after death. Maybe some died in battle and their bodies were left for eagles. Over time, these separate events might have merged into a single ritual tradition. The Blood Eagle. A composite story built from multiple sources, standardized by saga writers into a consistent narrative. This is how oral tradition works. It simplifies. It standardizes. It creates coherent stories from chaotic reality. The saga writers weren't lying when they recorded the Blood Eagle. They were recording the stories their culture had preserved. But those stories had been shaped by generations of retelling. So even if there's a historical core to the Blood Eagle, even if something like it happened once or twice, the stories we have are certainly embellished. The consistency across accounts might reflect standardization during oral transmission, not accurate preservation of details. Whether real or not, the Blood Eagle was performative. It was meant to be seen, talked about, remembered. Medieval executions were public spectacles. They weren't hidden. They were performed in front of audiences. The point wasn't just to kill someone. It was to demonstrate power. To warn others. To reinforce social order. The Blood Eagle, if performed, would have been a show. A ritual with audience. The elaborateness served theatrical purposes. Making it memorable. Making it spectacular. Making it something people would tell stories about. And if it wasn't performed but only threatened, the theatrical aspect was even more important. You had to describe it vividly. Make people imagine it. Make the threat real in their minds even if it never happened in reality. The sagas preserve this performative quality. They describe the Blood Eagle in detail. They place it in dramatic contexts. They make it vivid. Whether they're recording real events or preserving cultural theater, they're giving us the performance. This matters for interpretation. The saga accounts aren't like modern police reports trying to accurately document crimes. They're like medieval plays trying to convey meaning through dramatic presentation. Truth and performance weren't separate categories. Stories were meant to be true in a deeper sense, true to cultural values, true to the importance of events, even if not factually accurate in Eve. Redetailed, we've examined what the Blood Eagle tells us about Viking culture. About revenge and honor. About religion and sacrifice. About the psychology of extreme violence narratives. About how stories evolve and how performance shapes historical memory. In our final segment, we'll synthesize everything we've covered. We'll offer an assessment of what probably happened. And we'll reflect on why this story continues to fascinate us over 1,000 years after the Viking Age ended. We've spent 50 minutes examining the Blood Eagle from every angle. The saga accounts. The linguistic debate. The archaeological evidence. The scholarly positions. The cultural context. Now it's time to synthesize. To offer an assessment based on the evidence we've reviewed. What probably happened? The most likely explanation, based on the weight of evidence, is this: the Blood Eagle was originally a poetic metaphor that later generations took literally and elaborated into a detailed execution ritual. Here's why this interpretation seems strongest. The linguistic evidence is compelling. Old Norse poetry was complex and metaphorical. Cutting an eagle fits the pattern of death kennings. Early saga references are brief and could easily be poetic expressions. Only later accounts provide physical details. The absence of contemporary victim accounts is significant. If Vikings performed this execution on King Aelle in 867 AD, Anglo-Saxon chroniclers would have recorded it. They documented other Viking violence in detail. The silence suggests the Blood Eagle, as described, didn't happen. The lack of archaeological evidence matters. While absence of evidence isn't proof, we have skeletal evidence of other Viking violence. We don't have evidence of this specific pattern of damage. The medical implausibility of keeping victims conscious strengthens the case for legendary embellishment. Even if some form of the ritual existed, the saga descriptions are certainly exaggerated. But, and this is important, this doesn't mean Vikings were peaceful or that the stories have no historical basis. It just means the specific Blood Eagle ritual, as described in the sagas, probably didn't exist as a regular execution method. If the Blood Eagle wasn't real as described, what explains the stories? Several possibilities, which might all be partially true. First, Vikings did sacrifice enemies to Odin. We have evidence for this. Hanging, drowning, other forms of ritual killing. Giving someone to the eagles might have been a poetic way of describing these sacrifices. Over time, the phrase became associated with a specific ritual. Second, Vikings did mutilate enemy bodies after death. Displaying corpses. Arranging them symbolically. Post-mortem mutilation was part of their cultural practices. Creating an eagle shape from a corpse, while horrific, would fit this pattern. The saga writers might have described this practice while embellishing the detail that victims were alive. Third, Vikings definitely used psychological warfare. They cultivated reputations for extreme violence. They told stories designed to terrify enemies. The Blood Eagle might have been more threat than action. More propaganda than practice. But effective either way. Fourth, something resembling the Blood Eagle might have happened once. One particularly brutal leader might have executed one enemy in an unusually horrific way. The story spread. It became legendary. It was attributed to multiple events. But the core incident was singular and exceptional. Most likely, the truth involves elements of all these. Poetry. Post-mortem ritual. Psychological warfare. Rare exceptional events. All flowing together into the Blood Eagle tradition we find in the sagas. The saga writers weren't inventing from nothing. They were recording cultural memories, shaped by centuries of oral transmission, standardized into coherent narratives. The stories have historical roots. But they're not accurate historical records. Whether the Blood Eagle was real or not, it worked. The Vikings achieved their goal. They created a reputation for extreme violence that terrified their enemies. Communities surrendered rather than resist. Leaders paid tribute rather than fight. The fear was real even if the practice wasn't. And that reputation lasted. 1,000 years later, we're still talking about the Blood Eagle. Still debating whether it happened. Still feeling the chill when we read the descriptions. The television series Vikings depicted it. Audiences were horrified. The scene became one of the most talked about moments in the show. The Blood Eagle continues to terrify, just as it was meant to. This is the ultimate success of the narrative. Whether Vikings actually performed it or not, they created a story so powerful that it still affects us a millennium later. That's effective cultural production. That's propaganda that outlasted the culture that created it. Modern people who've never studied Viking history know about the Blood Eagle. It's become part of popular culture. It's referenced in games, books, films, music. The image has transcended its historical uncertainty and become an icon of extreme violence. The Vikings won the propaganda war. Comprehensively. Permanently. Why does the Blood Eagle continue to capture imagination? Why do we keep returning to this story? Part of it is the extreme nature of the violence described. Humans are drawn to extremes. We're fascinated by things that push boundaries. The Blood Eagle, real or not, represents violence at its most elaborate and ritualized. Part of it is the mystery. We don't know for certain if it happened. That ambiguity is compelling. We like unsolved questions. We enjoy debating possibilities. The uncertainty makes the Blood Eagle more interesting than well-documented practices. Part of it is the connection to Vikings themselves. Vikings occupy a specific place in popular imagination. Fierce warriors. Fearless explorers. Cultural outsiders who challenged the medieval European order. The Blood Eagle fits our image of Vikings as ultimate warriors. And part of it is what it reveals about human nature. That we're capable of creating such rituals, real or imagined. That cultures develop elaborate forms of violence. That storytelling and terror are so intertwined. The Blood Eagle makes us think about what humans are capable of. It's a mirror. Looking at the Blood Eagle, we see something about ourselves. About our capacity for violence. Our relationship with revenge. Our need for narratives that match the intensity of our emotions. Our willingness to believe in extreme horrors. Whether Vikings actually performed the Blood Eagle or not, the fact that the story exists tells us something uncomfortable about human culture. About what we can imagine doing to each other. About how we use stories of violence. So what's the truth about the Blood Eagle? We'll probably never know for certain. The evidence is centuries old. The sources are problematic. The archaeology is inconclusive. We're left with informed speculation, not definitive answers. But that uncertainty doesn't diminish the importance of the question. Examining the Blood Eagle has taught us about Vikings. About medieval Scandinavia. About oral tradition. About how history is recorded and preserved. About the relationship between fact and legend. It's taught us to be critical of sources. To ask who wrote something, when, and why. To understand that medieval chronicles aren't like modern journalism. To recognize that cultural memory shapes historical narratives. And it's taught us about ourselves. About why we're drawn to stories of extreme violence. About how fear and fascination intertwine. About why some historical questions remain compelling even when we can't answer them definitively. The Blood Eagle, whether real or legendary, has become part of our cultural inheritance. It exists now in the realm of iconic historical images. The Roman Colosseum. The pyramids of Egypt. The Viking Blood Eagle. Images that represent entire cultures in popular imagination, regardless of how accurate they are. And perhaps that's fitting. The Vikings wanted to be remembered as fierce and fearsome. They wanted their enemies to tell stories about them. They wanted their violence to be legendary. They got their wish. We are still telling the stories. This concludes part 1 of our exploration into the Viking Blood Eagle. We've examined the evidence, the debates, the cultural context, and offered our assessment. In part 2, we'll expand our view. We'll look at other Viking execution and torture methods that definitely existed. We'll explore berserkers and their battle rage. We'll examine human sacrifice in Norse religion more broadly. We'll see how the Blood Eagle fits into the larger pattern of Viking violence and ritual. Because whether or not the Blood Eagle was real, Viking violence certainly was. The raids, the battles, the sacrifices, the brutality, that's all documented. Understanding that context helps us understand why the Blood Eagle legend emerged and why it's so persistent. But for now, we've reached The end of this part of our journey. Thank you for exploring this dark corner of history with us. For thinking critically about sources. For considering the line between fact and legend. For wrestling with questions that don't have easy answers. The Blood Eagle exists in that uncertain space between history and myth. It's real enough to be recorded in multiple texts. Legendary enough to be doubted by modern scholars. And powerful enough to still affect us 1,000 years later. Rest well. Dream of saga writers in cold Icelandic halls. Of stories passed down through generations. Of the gap between what happened and what we remember happening. Of the power of narrative to outlast empires. And remember, whether the Blood Eagle was real or not, the Vikings achieved their goal. They made us fear them. They made us remember them. They made us tell their story. 1,000 years later, we're still doing it. Sweet dreams and good night.